The total number of personnel kept going up because the aspect they considered was how fast can you get it done, or more people get it done quicker. Sometimes you get in their own way, but at least that was the thinking at the time. There was quite a lot of people involved with the project, both at the Institute and in the Navy Yard, or the principal effort was in the Navy Yard. They had a building there, shows in the pictures I have, in which the upper floor, the top floor, was actually reserved for this project and the personnel involved. There was quite a lot of personnel at one time involved with this because the liaison efforts for getting hardware were quite enormous. And in the war years, you wanted stuff as fast, and you had the priority system. And it was AA, single A, AA, AAA priority, and if it was a real crash priority, you had some level above that, and somebody on the phone, possibly an admiral, calling up the manufacturer saying, we had to have this yesterday. That type of attitude prevailed all through the war and all through this project. And it got rather humorous at times, the way companies were cut out of projects and then given on a crash basis another one, or somebody who had a lower priority suddenly found themselves on the waiting list.
So would you say that this project had the highest priority possible?
It definitely did at that time have the highest priority possible. It was in the same category as some of the other projects they had with the maximum priority, like how to handle because it was involved with handling the problem of the subfleet menace, so it had the highest priority. Other things had very high priorities too, but that was on the highest echelon insofar as the Navy was concerned at that time, other than building ships, which was in a separate category. But we had to build that one ship for the test, and when it came to the time when they were ready to test equipment, the first thing they had to do was take the ship out to sea for a shakedown cruise, which is typically 3 days, to make sure it didn't leak, that everything worked, and so forth. And they had a dummy turret they put on turret number 2. And I might add that class of ship, which was a destroyer escort, only used a 3-inch gun mount at that time. They had 3 on some of them, 4 on some of the others, but they were 3-inch mounts did not have a fully enclosed turret. They had a partial turret, that is a sheet of heavy armor-resistant steel which stood about 6 feet, a little over 6 feet high off the deck, which shielded the gunners operating behind the gun, which had a plate mount in front of it. But it was not a complete turret, completely enclosed. When they went to the 5-inch turrets, then they enclosed them. That came on the later runs of the DEs and of course the larger ships, the Ds. The DEs were smaller ones, the DEs, and then they came to another class afterwards, which was still bigger. Small cruisers had 5-inch and up. Large cruisers still larger. But that was the kind of equipment we had to work with in the priority system. And after the shakedown cruise, of course, which involved a standard type of crew, they were ready to conduct the test. Then they started, shall we say, digging into the pickle barrel for the people in reserve for the actual testing of this equipment on that ship. They wanted a selected crew for several reasons. They didn't know what all might happen in terms of the effects on the personnel, number one. Number two, they wanted people who were selected which could be classified, highly classified, and kept silent, hopefully, about what happened. That fell apart later. But also that they could keep track of them in terms of medical results, medical problems that might develop. That was where Oscar Schneider came in, who was the naval officer in charge of the whole medical aspects of the test. Excuse me, Oscar Otto Schneider, Captain USN, originally in the German Navy, but that was a story that only came out much later, just before his death. It was only then that he told it to his son, and this was about 1986, approximately, he told the story.
He was a U-boat commander, wasn't he?
He was a U-boat commander originally, captured by the French about 1940, turned over to the Third Army, and then certain negotiations took place, which I've never gotten completely to the bottom of. But the U.S. Navy wanted him, and they brought him in, made him a medical officer for cover, is my feeling, because there was no time to send him through medical school. Suddenly he was a medical officer, And he was in charge of the medical aspects.
Did you interact with Oscar Schneider very much during this experiment?
No, I saw him, but I didn't interact with him.
So
no more than in a very peremptory manner, and of course certain aspects of it, everybody involved with the experiment who was going to be on board the ship for the test had to go through a series of medical tests, biopsies where tissue was cryogenically frozen and put into a vault for future reference.
So if he wasn't really a physician, what do you think his true role was, this Mr. Schneider?
That is something I'm still trying to get to the bottom of. But since I learned at a much later date, of course, the fact that Phil Schneider's father, Oscar Schneider, had been in the German Navy, was a U-boat commander, and the U.S. Navy wanted him, one has to ask why, obviously. And when some of the answers came through much later, I found out, among other things, in the course of research, that the German Navy was running their own program of invisibility at that time, the same parallel with ours. Only they were not testing surface ships, they were testing it on submarines to see if they could shield them so that we couldn't detect their subs, which would make sense in terms of a war.
They use Tesla technology.
And that test, or a series of tests, were made on their subs at sea, and apparently they were all failures. They lost every one of them. But during the process of the earlier phases of the test, there was a liaison between the United States government officials, certain ones, and the German Navy. How this was handled, I do not know, but I do know later it turned out that somebody I met, and the whole story came out, that he was in the German Navy at that time and was actually detailed to come over to the United States, meet with personnel involved with the experiment, namely myself, at Montauk Point, and when he would literally come in on a German sub, park out there off the point, they would bring him in by boat, there would be an exchange of information, and he would go back to Germany. And I was apparently authorized and ordered to give him an exchange of information. Don't ask me why. But this went on to a certain point, and it stopped. We know later, of course, that the Germans failed utterly in their testing, and they lost every sub they turned the equipment on with. They were missing something, which apparently we hoped that we had, namely the magic formula to make it work. But that was one of the strange aspects, because there was that liaison going on, and that says something else. Since I've examined all of the effects that were available after Oscar's death through his son, after his son's death, I inherited some of the books, and some of the books involved notebooks written by Oscar Schneider. I don't know when he wrote them or where he wrote them, whether it was in the U.S. or in Germany before he came into the U.S., but they detailed a lot of highly technical stuff, mathematics, and he was apparently working on the borders of, or in some manner was involved with the invisibility experiments of the Germans. That is the only thing I can see as the reason why the United States Navy would jump at the chance to get him. Otherwise, he was just a German sub-commander. Why would the U.S. Navy want a German sub-commander in the U.S. Navy?
Yeah, but then why position him as a physician?
Possibly to cover up other aspects. I'm only guessing
Hard
at this
to
point,
tell, isn't it?
because
Okay.
I don't know.
So you just briefly saw Oscar Schneider from a peripheral
Right.
point.
And playing his role as a physician. Now later on, his career, and he told this to his son, and I got the information from Phil, about 1955 or 6, actually around 55, because he was still on the periphery of the experiment, still writing notes and letters regarding the Philadelphia experiment. He got fed up with the whole business and he wanted out of the program. So he was transferred over to the nuclear sub-program, and he became part of that. He made contributions in terms of designing air conditioning hardware and such, so his mathematical background, which I saw hard evidence of, and the fact that he had engineering training apparently came to the fore, and he was useful in the nuclear sub-program. He was, of course, still an officer, a captain, and there's a picture of the launching of the first nuclear sub with him on the deck, along with a whole staff of officers who were apparently partly honorary and partly actually members of the crew. Because it was quite a celebration, if you will, when we built and launched our first nuclear sub. And he was part of that. So he had a long career in the Navy, and he finally retired. And he obviously was not just an MD, and nothing was ever mentioned again about him being an MD when he was working in the Navy and other projects later on. So I do think it was a cover, but I don't know the whole story. But it's a very interesting side issue.
So, well, we're at the point where we introduced Oscar Schneider,
right?
As you just saw him as part of the experiment,
right?
And then we'll move on from there. And I was asking about the equipment that you said there were several different manufacturers.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically any other names.
Any other names? Okay.
No.
Could you describe physically what, say, inside the ship, the control panel that you and Duncan operated? What did that look like?
Actually, there's more than one. There was a primary panel, and there's a secondary one which controlled some of the settings on the auxiliary equipment.
Were these huge panels?
They weren't that large, actually. They were all stuck in the control room. And the control room was an appropriated room with other electronic equipment, in which part of these stacks of 6L6s, which drove the field coils of the two large generators, of course, 300 per coil, so there was actually 3,000 6L6s scattered around in racks all over, partly in that room, partly in a subsection on the lower deck in the ship. There was other equipment which was involved with the generating the RF frequencies and the RF modulation. There was a master control panel for the timing, for the pulse generators and such. There was a special pulse generator used. There was also another strange piece of equipment which was hidden in that rack. That was what we call the zero-time reference generator. Now that was a very special piece of equipment which I had forgotten all about until I ran into it at a much later date in another project as aLFRED. But basically the zero-time reference generator was something which Tesla designed in the 20s, which became very useful for this project, because what it did was it established a link to the zero-time reference to the center of the galaxy. Now this may sound like far-out engineering, far beyond anything possible, but remember, Tesla was a man who was far out and did things beyond the possible. And what he did at the time was, in one of the projects he was working on at the time when the FAA was in its precursor to being set up, and we were considering, of course, not only transcontinental airline traffic, but of course airline traffic worldwide eventually. And it started to come into place in the late 20s and early 30s. They had to have a navigational system for all of the available, shall we say, navigational channels, if you want to call them that, the navigational routes, wherein a plane could go from the area of one transmitting system into the next transmitting system and the next, and not have a problem with the phasing of the signals. This was a problem which was dumped in Tesla's lap. How do you design a master oscillator and a master frequency control system so that all of the systems around the world will all be operating in total unison and totally synchronized? That was a major problem. I would say today you use phase-locked oscillator system, and of course you can do it via satellite, link them all together so they're all phase-locked to each other. There was no way of doing that at that time. Not that they couldn't design a phase-lock oscillator, but we were talking about synchronizing systems around the planet, which nobody had a concept of how the blazes you're going to do it. Hey, Tesla, maybe you can solve this one for us. And he did. It was called the zero-time reference generator. Now, what is this thing in terms of the physical hardware? It is something which is very hard to explain. I've had units in my hands. I still use them, and because later on I found them still being used. The FAA was still using them in the 60s. They're probably still using them today. You set up in a rack box, a standard 19-inch rack, a motor operating off the AC line at 60 hertz and a generator system which generates a certain series of frequencies, and there is a feedback coupling between them. There's a mechanical coupling, and nobody can fully explain to this day how the system works. Probably Tesla could easily. unless somebody in the secret